Today we are in the garden because we are talking about carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are our life force, they are energy giving, and we need to speak out about the powerful impact that eating carbohydrates can have on your life. The majority of carbohydrates are found in plant foods, which is why we're in the garden. And the other source of carbohydrates is milk, but majority of carbohydrates are plants. So if you're a vegan, if you're a vegetarian, you're probably eating a lot of carbohydrate-rich foods. And the majority of you probably also incorporate plants in your diet, so you also are getting carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are actually made through photosynthesis. Photosynthesis uses the chlorophyll in the green of these plant leaves or any green plant leaves and makes carbohydrate from carbon dioxide and water. So how does that process work? The water in the plant is actually from the plant's roots. The plant's roots absorb water. So that's where we're getting the water that's needed to make carbohydrates. So the carbon dioxide is absorbed in the green leaves of the plant, and that's donating carbon and oxygen to the carbohydrate. Carbohydrate just means carbon and water, carbohydrate, and water is hydrogen and oxygen. So to make a carbohydrate, this carbon and water structure, you need carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. You combine carbon dioxide and water, you get glucose. And glucose is like the OG carbohydrate. It is the simplest carbohydrate, and it is the carbohydrate our body most likes to use for energy. So you have the water and the carbon dioxide forming glucose, OG carbohydrate, simplest unit of carbohydrates, and it's really the sun's energy that is then transferred into the chemical bonds of glucose. And there are three main types of carbohydrates. There are monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. And let's look at the structures of each of these. Let's take a look at the three monosaccharides. So monosaccharide means one unit of sugar, and you know, the original gangster sugar is still glucose. So here's the structure of glucose. You can see I'm writing it out on the whiteboard, and it's basically a ring structure, and at each corner of the ring are carbons, except for the one corner that has an oxygen. So that's glucose. Next we have galactose. Galactose is also a 6-carbon sugar, and it looks really similar to glucose. So you can see it has the oxygen on one corner of the ring, and then it has pretty much the exact same structure as glucose, except right here where you can see OH is on the top and the hydrogen is on the bottom. But otherwise, glucose and galactose are incredibly similar. Next we have fructose, and fructose looks a little bit different than glucose and galactose, and it's commonly drawn as a pentagon. Instead of having the 5 carbons be part of the ring structure, fructose has 4 carbons as part of the ring structure, and then it has 2 carbons outside of the ring structure. So you can see there's 2 points where it's CH2OH outside of the ring structure. So those are our monosaccharides: fructose, glucose, and galactose. The next thing we should focus on are our disaccharides. And disaccharides just mean a combination of the different monosaccharides, resulting in a 2-unit sugar. The first disaccharide we're going to draw out is a combination of fructose and glucose. Instead of drawing out every single element that's in the structure, I'm just using the shorthand here. So we have the fructose unit, the pentagon. The fructose unit is bonded to a glucose unit. There it is, to form sucrose. And sucrose is our basic white sugar. So anytime you see sugar in baking, you're using sucrose. The next disaccharide is a combination of 2 glucose molecules bonded together. So 2 purple hexagons, 2 glucoses, and it forms maltose. Finally, our last disaccharide is a combination of glucose and galactose. So you bond glucose with galactose and you get lactose. And many of you might know lactose as the milk sugar. So the sugar that we find in milk, that's lactose. So here we have our 3 monosaccharides, fructose, glucose, galactose, and our 3 disaccharides, sucrose, maltose, and lactose. If we combine more than 2 units of sugar or more than 2 monosaccharides, we get what are called polysaccharides. And the 3 most relevant polysaccharides for our nutrition discussions are starch, glycogen, and fiber. So all of these involve linking glucose molecules together. So in this drawing, the glucose is depicted as the purple hexagon, and then you can see how it's linked together in various formations to form the 3 polysaccharides. So let's start by talking about starch. And so in starch, the glucose molecules are bonded together in these long branched chains. And human digestive enzymes can then come in and cut the bonds between the glucose to make monosaccharides and digest the starch and the polysaccharides. Starch is plants' storage form of glucose. So you're going to find starch in your plant foods like fruits, veggies, and whole grains. You might have heard the phrase starchy vegetables before, and that's for veggies like potatoes and carrots and corn that contain quite a bit of starch. So starch is stored in the granules in the plant seeds, like in the corn kernels, and it really provides the plant with energy to nourish the seed in the ground until the plant is able to form shoots and leaves. So that's why we find starch in our plant foods. The next polysaccharide is glycogen, and glycogen is actually very similar to starch in structure. We have the bonds between branched chains of glucose. And again, human enzymes can split the bonds between the glucose. But what's the biggest difference between glycogen and starch is that glycogen is often more highly branched than starch. And that just gives enzymes a little bit easier access to breaking up the glucose. And that can be nice when you need energy more quickly. Glycogen is an animal's storage form of glucose. You're going to find glycogen in any animals, and included in this is humans. So humans store glucose as glycogen, and the majority of glycogen in humans is stored in our livers and our muscles. So we're going to store glycogen in liver and muscle. Now you might wonder, well, why doesn't meat have a lot of glycogen in it? Meat doesn't have very much glycogen because glycogen will break down really rapidly when meat is slaughtered. And so that's why you're not going to find a lot of carbohydrate or glycogen in meat products like chicken, beef, pork, etc. Our last polysaccharide is our fiber. And fiber looks pretty different than the starch and the glycogen. And the difference that I want you to know is in the bond. And the bonds are kind of in an S form rather than this V form. And this type of bond indicates that they're bonded differently. And the issue with that is that human enzymes cannot digest these bonds. So humans have a hard time breaking the bonds between the fibers, and that's why we can't really digest fiber and why it then provides bulk to our stool, because we can't digest it, and so it goes all the way through our digestive tract. Fibers are necessary to be the supporting and protective structures of plants. So it's helping them, not just be mushy balls of glucose. And they are polysaccharide chains. You can see they're chains of connected glucose in this case, but our human enzymes cannot digest them, and so we can't break these bonds between the monosaccharides for fiber. This causes them to pass through the digestive system largely undigested, and then you can get some breakdown from bacteria in the large intestine, but by and large, fiber is going to pass through just as it is. Okay, so we know about the 3 different types of carbohydrates, the monosaccharides, the disaccharides, and the polysaccharides, but how do I digest and absorb all of these different types of carbohydrates? We talked a little bit about it in the digestion video, but let's get specific about how carbohydrates are digested and absorbed. Let's talk about digestion and absorption of carbohydrates. Let's say you just eaten a donut. Well, that donut's gonna have monosaccharides, depicted here as the red hexagons, disaccharides depicted here as the blue hexagons, and then starches, which aren't in the graphic but can just be envisioned as larger chains of the blue and the red hexagons. So in your mouth you have the activation of salivary amylase, which is really where carbohydrate digestion begins. So you start to break down a little bit of the starch and the disaccharides, and what you're trying to do is break everything down into the monosaccharide units, because those are what are going to be absorbed. In the stomachs, carbohydrate digestion kind of pauses because the salivary amylase is denatured by stomach acid, but then in the small intestine, carbohydrate digestion really goes into overdrive. So you have the release from the pancreas of an enzyme that will help to break down the starches, so the longer polysaccharide chains will be broken down by this pancreatic enzyme, and that will leave you with mostly monosaccharides and disaccharides. And then in the lining and the surface of the cells in the small intestine, you have different enzymes which will break the disaccharides into monosaccharide units. One of these, for example, is lactase, and the reason that some people can't digest milk sugar, which is lactose, is because they don't have enough of the enzyme lactase, and so they can't break down the disaccharide lactose. More on that in a second. But once you have the monosaccharide units from either just being monosaccharide units from the donut or from digesting the disaccharides and the starches, those monosaccharide units are directly absorbed into the blood. From there, they can flow to the liver, and in the liver, the glucose is good to go. It will be released again back to the blood to circulate to other cells for energy. Meanwhile, galactose and fructose have to be restructured into glucose in order to then be recirculated. So the liver will restructure galactose and fructose and then release all of the glucose back to the blood in order to circulate and provide energy for other cells. So that's an overview of digestion and absorption of carbohydrate. Once we have taken all of the carbohydrate in the food that we eat and broken it down into its component monosaccharides, the glucose, the fructose, the galactose, and then converted galactose and fructose into glucose to send it out to the cells for energy, how do the cells get energy from glucose? Because that's really the point of carbohydrates. They're our energy-giving nutrient, and certain cells in our brain will only use glucose for energy. So that's why it's so important to eat carbohydrate. Your body really always needs to have some to function its best. So what's happening when we're getting energy from the glucose is in the cell, you're going through a process, glycolysis and then cellular respiration. Glycolysis is the breaking of glucose. So you break glucose into 2 halves, and then you can send those 2 halves off to do various different things. But one of them is called cellular respiration, where you take that glucose remnant, you run it through a really complex series of reactions that we are not going to get into in this class, but you can take biochem if you would like to memorize all of the structures, all of the enzymes involved in taking the glucose remnant and extracting energy from it. And the energy unit that you get from glucose is called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. ATP. So you're taking glucose and you're getting ATP in the mitochondria of your cell, and then the cells run on ATP. That's like the cellular unit of energy. So we've gone all the way from food, where we have a certain number of calories in our food, a certain number of grams of carbohydrate. We've eaten the food, we've digested the carbohydrate, we've gotten straight up glucose from whatever carb was in that food, and then we are splitting that glucose and getting ATP as our energy source. So that's really how we extract energy from glucose. So what happens if you don't have enough glucose? Well, if you don't eat enough carbohydrate and you don't have enough glucose, a few things could happen. You could end up using protein to try to make glucose, because we can make glucose from protein, but the reason that we don't want to be doing that is because at a certain level, you will then start to decompose your body's proteins, i.e. your muscles, in order to fulfill your cell's glucose needs. So you really don't want to be using protein for energy. It is a waste of what protein is supposed to be doing. You can not convert fat into glucose. You can use fat for energy in a process called ketosis, where you are able to extract energy from fat. However, you cannot turn fat into glucose. So the system that your body has to switch into to run on fat is very different from what it would like to be doing with running on glucose and carbohydrate. I mentioned a process called ketosis, and our body uses the process of ketosis when we do not have enough carbohydrate, so we don't have enough glucose to extract energy from glucose. Ketosis is not the optimal way for our bodies to get energy. It is somewhat stressful for our bodies to do ketosis, and our brain would much prefer to just have glucose rather than ketone bodies. Some of the cells in our brain will only run on glucose. But if we have to go into ketosis, what we're doing is we're breaking down fat and trying to use it for energy. In ketosis, we form what are called ketone bodies, and we only do this from fat when carbohydrate is gone. And you can see on the right side of the screen the structures of some ketone bodies like acetone. And these compounds, these ketone bodies, will provide energy to the brain and the nervous system when we don't have glucose. But we still are going to experience some protein breakdown when we're using ketone bodies, because certain cells in the brain will only take glucose. Ketone bodies are really acidic, so this can inhibit some nutrient metabolism and disrupt our acid-base balance if it's continued over a long period of time. Now, lately, ketosis and ketone bodies have become really a hot topic because of the keto diet. And on the keto diet, you are really trying to stay in ketosis. So this is a really low carbohydrate, even a pretty low protein diet. It's very high in fat. So on the keto diet, you get 60 to 75% of your calories from fat, 15 to 30% from protein, and 5 to 10% of your calories from carbohydrate. So you're really trying to put yourself into ketosis where you're only using fat for energy. So types of foods that one might eat on this diet would be things like butter, cheese, meats, fish, eggs, and low carbohydrate vegetables. So again, it's a very high fat diet, and it doesn't match the dietary guidelines for whatever that's worth. The keto diet was not designed for weight loss. It was not designed for diabetes control. It was actually designed for those who have epilepsy, and it has shown to reduce seizures in some people who have epilepsy, but it was not designed for long-term weight loss. It is really a classic fad diet because it eliminates a complete class of foods, carbohydrates, and we need carbohydrates for energy to function at our absolute best. It also really restricts your fruit intake, it restricts your legume and bean intake, and it does restrict some of your vegetable intake too. So it is absolutely not known the long-term effects of following a keto diet on things like heart health or even on weight loss. People might lose weight over the short term, but are they able to maintain that weight loss over time on such a restrictive diet is a really open question. But it has been one of the hot top diets of the times lately. And so I'm just mentioning it so that you don't think I'm ignoring it, but I would absolutely never recommend it to anybody who did not have epilepsy because it is so restrictive, and I do not think it sets you up to have a healthy, happy, inclusive relationship with food. Back to our regular scheduled programming where we're using carbohydrates and glucose for energy, and we are not going into ketosis, and we are not on the keto diet. No. So back to regularly using glucose, we need to regulate our blood glucose level because we don't want it to get too high or too low, because in both of those states we can feel kind of sick. So if it's too high, you can feel confused, you could have difficulty breathing. If it's too low, you might feel dizzy, like you're gonna pass out. So you want to have your blood glucose regulated. And in someone who does not have diabetes, we are able to regulate our blood glucose in between meals with the release of insulin and glucagon. So remember, we went through this whole process in the cells and hormones and nervous system video, so I will link to that below. But insulin and glucagon are really key in regulating our blood sugar. When our blood sugar is high, we're going to release insulin, which will signal to the muscle, liver, and fat tissue to take up glucose from the blood. And in the muscle and liver, you will store glucose as glycogen. Remember, glycogen is a storage form of glucose. In fat cells, you'll convert glucose into fat and store it like that. But that's how insulin is kind of signaling to all these cells to get glucose out of the blood. On the flip side, if we have low blood sugar, we haven't eaten for a while, and we need more glucose in our blood, we will release glucagon, and glucagon will tell the liver to release its glycogen. And the liver has about a 1-day store of glycogen, so it's not infinite amount at all. We do need to eat to replenish that. But the glycogen in the liver is really highly branched, and so enzymes can easily get in and cut the glycogen into the monosaccharide glucose units, release them into the blood, and we will then have our blood sugar be raised. So that is really how glucagon and insulin are integral in controlling our blood sugar. I like to remember glucagon because it's released when glucose is gone. Glucagon. And that's one way you can remember which hormone is doing which. So when glucose is gone, you need glucagon. So glucagon will signal to your cells to give glucose back to the blood to then keep your blood sugar in a narrow band. If you have diabetes, you have an issue with the insulin system, so you either don't make enough insulin or you don't respond to it enough, and so that's why you might have to inject insulin or take a medication that will help with your response to insulin. But everyone who doesn't have diabetes is able to kind of subconsciously regulate their blood glucose over time in between meals and after meals. Alright, so we've learned about the magic of glucose regulation, and we know that if you don't eat enough carbohydrate and have enough glucose, your body's going to go into ketosis and use ketone bodies from fat as energy. But what if you have too much glucose? So you have excess carbohydrate intake, more energy than you need. How is your body going to deal with this extra glucose? Because as we know, it can't go in the blood, so where is it going to be stored? What are you going to do with it? Your body's going to do one of three things. First thing that your body will do with extra glucose is that it will store it as glycogen in your muscle and your liver. So we've talked a lot about that, how insulin will signal for your muscle and your liver cells to take up this extra glucose and make glycogen. And so that's what you'll do first with excess glucose. The next thing that your body might do is to try to burn the glucose as energy rather than to burn fat for energy. So you'll use your extra glucose energy first and run it through your fuel burning system But because you're not burning any excess fat, you're then gonna store the fat, because it's really easy to store the fat we eat as fat in our bodies. So instead of burning that fat for energy, you'll burn extra carbohydrate or extra glucose first, and then you will store fat. So that's the second thing that could happen. The third thing that could happen is if you have so much extra glucose that your glycogen stores are full in your muscle and your liver, you've burned as much energy as you can. The next thing that you'll do is that you will break down that glucose and you will store it as fat. So the liver can break down extra glucose and it will convert it into fatty acids, and then you'll store those as fat. So carbohydrate, eating extra carbohydrate past your calorie needs for the day can result in you storing that extra carbohydrate as fat. So carb can be converted to fat. That's why, like in the early 90s when low-fat diets were all the rage, people could still gain weight on those because you can easily convert carbohydrate into fat and then store that. And we have like pretty much infinite fat stores, so there's not really a limit on how much fat we can store. And we will talk about how all the macronutrients can get converted from one to another as we go through, and at the end of our macronutrient section, I will give you a total overview on like which can go where. But for now, you can know that carb can be converted into fat and stored for energy. So those are the things we'll do with excess carbohydrate. We'll either store as glycogen, we will use for energy, or we will store as fat. We made it! I'm sorry this video is pretty long, but it's carbohydrate and we needed a lot of energy to get through it. I even needed an outfit change. Took me so many days to film, but we made it. And so now we've talked about types of carbohydrate, how to digest and absorb carbohydrate, how we regulate our blood glucose, what happens if we don't have enough carbohydrate, if we have too much carbohydrate. Oh my God, we've talked about so much. But what we haven't talked about is really the food applications for carbohydrate. And that's what we're gonna do next time, and it's gonna be really interesting. I hope it'll be super applicable, and talk about fiber and sugar and whole grains and where we find carbohydrate in food. You're gonna love it. Bye! I'd also just like to point out that I'm wearing some really cool sneakers today. I would like everyone to see. One of my least favorite things about quarantine is that nobody gets to see my cool sneaker collection. You would think that I would have stopped buying sneakers at this point because I don't wear them anywhere, because I don't go anywhere. But in fact, I have not done that, and now I have even more cool pairs of sneakers than I had at the beginning of quarantine. Hashtag self-care, but nowhere to see, no one to show them off to. If we were in class together, I take such pride in matching my sneakers to my outfit. But it's just not to be. Big sacrifices over here. Big sacrifices.